Okay, so in this video, you were able to hear Steven Pinker talk about the idea that some of our ability to recognize the regular words in our language is probably due to some innate ability. It's not about reinforcement. It's probably due to something innate. And I really wanted you to see this video because he really displayed how we could figure that out experimentally, right? So by making up words, this is a wug, this is a toma, we eliminate the possibility that the child somehow learned these forms in their environment, right? To pluralize a wug into wugs, they have to be applying a rule on the fly. So as long as you are talking just about natural language and things that are happening in a person's world, you might make the incorrect assumption that they somehow were reinforced for using this particular form of this particular word. But when they can apply the pluralization rules on the fly, or they can apply the past tense rules on the fly, it really shows us that something else is going on. Well, it turns out it wasn't Pinker who originally offered the alternative explanation that allowed linguists to explain all language phenomena, not just the acquisition of vocabulary like Skinner had been able to do. It was a guy named Noam Chomsky. Chomsky said that we carry around in our heads a universal grammar that allows us to figure out the regularities in the language so that we can then apply those rules on our own. So universal grammar was introduced by Chomsky as a way to explain those universal errors. So our universal grammar tells us if it happened in the past, put an ed on the end. If it's plural, add an s. If it's a superlative, add an est to it. And the way that I know that this is happening without us even knowing it's happening is that a lot of my students will say to me, what's a superlative? So clearly you don't have in your mind, oh gosh, I want to say the superlative form of this. I shall throw an est onto the end of it. It's happening very much on the fly. And like Pinker was sort of alluding to in the video, it's quicker to apply the rule, and really it happens once the vocabulary exceeds about 1,000 words. So when you have really little children who don't know very many words, they may correctly use past tense for went or fell or something like that. And then once their vocabulary gets large enough, all of a sudden you'll hear them say things like wented, or my daughter mispronounced fell as falded. She put two eds on the end of fall. So she would say falded. And I'm like, I have her on videotape when she was just past 2 saying fell down. And then when she was 3, she was saying falded. And it's like, how did you know it at one point and now you don't know it anymore? Well, her vocabulary had gotten really large. And so it became too much to try and memorize each individual form of each individual word. So she started to apply the rules. Now you might have noticed in that video that the children both got the past tense of say correctly. They said said. And one of the reasons why they say said does kind of give us a little nod to Skinner. That's a term that children hear a lot when they're little. I said come here. I said put that down. I said brush your teeth. I said get in bed. Right? Like we have so many orders that we give little children that start with I said, that they learn really quickly. Like that's high repetition phrasing. There are certain words that even as adults, we struggle with the correct conjugation. My personal struggle is with the past tense of drink. Is it drank? Is it drunk? I know it's not drinked. I know that. So, things that aren't said very frequently, even as adults will struggle with these rules. So imagine for a little child how liberating it is to at least know ed, s, est. I can process most words. So it's quicker. It takes a lot less cognitive effort if you can just apply the rule. So what Chomsky did for us by introducing this theory is that he was able to account for vocabulary acquisition, that it is about exposure and frequency of experience with the words and things like that. And then he also was able to account for why these errors were made. So that's why his theory overturned Skinner's theory. So let's take this a little bit farther and talk about paradigms. A paradigm is an overall theory that guides an entire field. And in some cases, we have some paradigms that are so well accepted that they actually guide entire fields, plural. An example of that would be evolution. It's so well accepted, so well documented, so well supported that it doesn't just affect paleontology or biology. It affects psychology. It affects pretty much everything. Like all of science is affected by this paradigm called evolution. So it's an overall theory that's really well accepted, that has become almost like tacitly, like we all think it's true kind of thing. We're just going to use it as our starting point. It's like, okay, so given that there's evolution, now what else are we going to say? Right? That's what a paradigm is. So it's an overall theory that's so well documented and so well supported that it started to become sort of just the starting point for any research in that area. When I was in grad school, I was assigned to read this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And actually, this is not my book, but I found a picture of the exact, what the cover looked like in the version I read. It's written by a philosopher, Thomas Kuhn, and he's talking about paradigm shifts in this book. And what I really remember about it is not just the process of how paradigms can shift. So the idea being that, like right now, the paradigm might be that evolution is as described by the theory of evolution, but that it could shift to an alternative theory if there was enough evidence and stuff. So that's part of it. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. What I wanted to point out is that when I read this book, as a grad student in psychology, clearly I was investing a lot of my life and energy and things into the field of psychology. And I've been assigned to read this book about scientific revolutions. And in this book, he points out that psychology doesn't have any real paradigms. And weirdly, it kind of offended me. I was like, wait, what do you mean by that? Of course there are paradigms in psychology. So while I'm supposed to be reading my book, of course, I decided to take a moment to sit there and think about things that I thought might be paradigmatic in psychology. It took me about, 20 years of thinking about it. And I think I might have come up with a concept or a theory that is so well accepted and has such far reach in our field that it might be a paradigm. I think I'm out on a limb by myself on this one. I'm not exactly sure that other psychologists would agree with it, but I'm going to throw out the idea of associationism. You might have learned about associationism in some of your psychology classes. It is the idea that we put two things together in our minds if they happen close in time, or if they happen, physically close to each other, if they happen sequentially, like one right after another, we tend to think that they're related to each other, that they go together, that they are associated. And we may even take it one step farther and think that one's causing the other, right? That's associationism. And I thought I'd throw out like some areas of psychology that have been affected by associationism. Like it's the whole underpinning of the field of learning theory. So learning theory is one area of psychology that like depends on the concept of associationism. Then there's in clinical psychology, there are a lot of psychological disorders that we think might develop through association, like phobias. That if you go back to John Watson and his research with little Albert, he was able to induce a phobia of white rats and actually other white fuzzy things by pairing the rat with a loud noise. Right? That's an association that was formed. In my field of cognitive psychology, we kind of have this model that our different little elements of each memory that we hold in our head is stored in different nodes in our brain, and that those nodes are all associated with each other in neural networks that allow us to have like spreading activation of information through our neural network so we can retrieve memories and make new thoughts and stuff like that. And then I thought I think there's even some associationism present in some social psychology theories. Like the in-group, out-group bias is based on the idea that people who share characteristics of some sort with me, I will think belong to my group, and I will feel like I'm related in some way to them or have some kind of shared experience, or just I make some positive assumptions about people who I feel like are like me. And then there are the thems, the people who aren't like me, that I feel like I don't have as much overlap with. That's a type of associationism. So I feel kind of like maybe, hopefully I made a good case for the idea that maybe associationism is an overall paradigm in psychology. I have not had the chance to really talk about it with any philosophers, whether this would pass the test or not. But I don't know, it really made me feel super defensive, that the idea that our field is just sort of like floundering around and there's no overarching paradigm guiding us. And I'm like, that's a little hurtful. So this is what I came up with. Anyway, what Thomas Kuhn talked about in his scientific revolutions was the revolution that we call a paradigm shift. So when we have a paradigm shift, it's not a smooth transition. It's not easy to go from an overarching explanation that everybody in the field has been accepting, and then the recognition that it might be wrong, and in fact we need to abandon all the things that we had been thinking and recognize that this other explanation is actually better. Let me show you some vague examples, and then I'll give you a really concrete example. So first off, let's assume that there's an existing theory and it's doing a good job of explaining, the existing data. Everything's fine. We're going along, nice stable paradigm. Like all the data that we're finding is consistent, can be explained through the existing theory. That's how we have a nice stable paradigm. The theory is doing the job it's supposed to be doing. Now let's say that a new theory comes along that explains maybe some parts of the existing data that had previously not been well incorporated into the theory. So for the example I gave about language acquisition, this is where, Chomsky comes in and has an explanation for those, those universal grammatical errors that children make. So it can come in and it can explain the new data, but let's say that's all it can explain is new data. It doesn't do a better or different job of explaining the existing data, or the existing data doesn't neatly fit into this new theory. Well, then we're going to have dueling paradigms. We're going to be saying, well, the first theory does a good job of explaining this stuff, and the second theory does a good job of explaining that stuff. And so we sort of have these dueling theories trying to determine which one's actually the better theory. A good example from our previous lectures would be hypnosis. We have so many theories about what hypnosis actually is. And so one theory does a great job of explaining the kind of hypnosis that helps people to endure dental procedures without Novocaine and things like that. How we have the one theory, the dissociation theory, that really helps to explain pain management through hypnosis. But it doesn't do a very good job of explaining stage hypnosis. Like, why do some people get induced into this mindset that allows them to think that they're a chicken or that they can lift 1,000 pounds? I mean, how does that happen? It's not really well explained through dissociation. It's better explained through, expectation or suggestibility. Right. So we've got multiple theories of what hypnosis actually is, in part because each theory explains part of hypnosis. Same thing with dreaming. I mean, none of them explain everything. And so what we have is multiple theories. I will acknowledge at this point that what we have explaining hypnosis or what we have explaining dreams are not paradigms. They really are theories at best, maybe hypotheses. So I'll acknowledge that. But the idea is that you can have, these dueling interpretations. You can turn to just about any chapter in an intro to psych textbook, and you'll find multiple theories explaining aspects of the phenomenon. I was just thinking about, if you turn to the chapter on emotion, there are for sure 2 solid theories on emotion, and actually there's a third one that sort of is a hybrid between them. The idea is we don't know which one is generally right. We know that this one does a really good job of explaining this aspect of emotion. We know that this one explains this part of emotion, but neither of them explain all the aspects. And that's the thing about these dueling theories or these dueling paradigms. Okay, but what I wanted to focus on with the paradigm shift is the idea that if the new theory explains the new data, part of the phenomena that the existing theory hadn't been explaining, and it explains the existing data. So this is what we saw with Chomsky's theory, right? He was able to explain the irregularities in the grammar, and he was able to explain how vocabulary is established. Now we have something else going on. Now we don't have dueling paradigms. Instead, what we have is a paradigm shift, where ultimately people start to realize, researchers in the area, scientists start to realize that this new theory is actually the better explanation for the phenomenon. It accounts for more of the data. It's maybe more elegant. Therefore, it makes, it meets that criterion of being, simple but comprehensive, all the things that we want to see in a good theory. So paradigm shift. So, we've seen paradigm shifts in that Thomas Kuhn book. If you have a free, week to read it, actually is pretty brief. It's kind of about the same size as the How to Think Straight About Psychology book, but it talks about how science goes through these stresses when there's a new theory vying for dominance. And he talks about like when paleontology realized that it probably was a meteor that killed the dinosaurs. This was back in the 70s. And previously they thought that the dinosaurs had gone extinct for a variety of different reasons. A volcano had erupted, or they got sick for some reason, or there were all these different accounts for why the dinosaurs went extinct. And then in the 1970s, somebody introduced the idea of a meteor hitting the earth and making basically a really long winter, and they couldn't survive it. It took a while for the field to shift over and start accepting that paradigm. It's not like people go, oh, wow, that's a way better explanation. I will just follow you now, and all this work I've been doing in the field and all the papers I've written and all that, I guess I was wrong. I'll just embrace this new interpretation. Hopefully you see how ridiculous that would be, that people would just happily switch over. Instead, there's a lot of stress, and there are a lot of debates at conferences, and there are lots of back and forths in the literature as, this guy tries to show that, and this woman tries to show this, and they're going back and forth, trying to figure out whose, interpretation is actually most accurate. There was a little moment where it looked like there might be some evidence that a meteor maybe hadn't been the source of the dinosaur death, and that was happening back in the 90s. And then finally, a company that was searching for oil in the Gulf of Mexico found the site that has got to be where the meteor impacted. It's the right size, it's the right age, and so now it seems like the idea that dinosaurs were killed by a meteor is pretty solidly supported. But I'm going to say it's not proven, is it? Because nothing's ever proven. It's possible that we'll find the evidence that explains it better someday in the future. But for right now, it looks like the paradigm has shifted, and now it is sort of generally accepted. It's like the starting point in paleontology that dinosaurs were killed by a meteor. So it's stressful. The same kind of stress went through the physics community when Einstein introduced his theory of relativity. In hindsight, we call you Einstein if we think you're really smart, and we assume he knew everything and that everybody believed the things he said. But back at the time when he was introducing these new theories, the existing theories, the people who were really embracing the existing theory didn't really want to hear his new idea. He was sort of stirring the pot and ruining everybody's research, and it was really stressful for the field. And we're going to talk a little bit more in the future in this class about how it now has become the case that Einstein's theory of relativity has sort of been, his quantum physics has become the paradigm. And so as a result, now researchers are looking for flaws in the paradigm. Like, that's how science works. Okay, we all are starting from this starting point. Now let's see if we can try and falsify it. And if it stands up to the falsification attempts, then it gains in credibility, right? Like, that's how it works. All right, so paradigm shift. So I thought I'd share with you some examples from psychology's history of times when researchers' findings contradicted the paradigm and it did not cause a shift, right? Finding contradictory evidence does not cause a paradigm shift. So Freud has his model of, the mind or consciousness, where he says, we've got the part of our brain that, or our mind, that's above the water level and you're conscious of. And then you have your personal unconscious that's under the water line, and it contains all of your own personal memories of embarrassing things or impulses or whatever that you don't want to ever think about again. That's all in your personal unconscious. And he thought this is what constituted your mind. Your own personal experiences make up all of your mind, and some of it you're aware of and some of it is below the waterline and it's unconscious. Well, his follower Jung said, I agree, except for I'm going to add another layer. And he says down below the personal unconscious would be the collective unconscious. And that's the part of the brain or the mind that we inherited as a member of our species. And it has all the memories and things that we carry around with us as a function of being human. So that we don't have to necessarily learn everything over. We carry with us certain details. We have certain predispositions that are sort of, he said, human predispositions to think about things in certain ways. And he said that's because of the collective unconscious. So now I kind of had to explain the collective unconscious to you, because unless you've had personality theory, you probably haven't heard of Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. It's not a really common idea. Whereas, like I said at the very first lecture of this class, everybody's heard about Freud. And everybody has a vague knowledge of concepts like the unconscious. And I think most people, when they hear the word the unconscious, they think personal unconscious, right? Things that you're embarrassed of or that are too painful or whatever. There are very few people, unless they've studied Jung, who think about this concept of the collective unconscious. So he did not have a huge impact on the way that people think about these structures that might be inside of our personality or our mind. One more example. Hopefully you all remember Pavlov and his classical conditioning, where, it turns out he didn't mean to. He inadvertently trained dogs to drool to bells. Later it became like his life's work to figure out how to get the drooling to work. But the idea he discovered is that the unconditioned stimulus, which in this case would be the dog food, must come right after the conditioned stimulus, which in this case is the bell. So you ring the bell, immediately give the dog the food. Ring the bell, immediately give the dog the food. And he says he said that if the delay was too long between the ringing of the bell and the presentation of the food, the dog won't condition as quickly. They'll not notice the association between the bell and the food. Okay. So one of his followers, a guy named Garcia, studied a special case of classical conditioning, which was presenting the learner with something that makes them sick. So, and then would they in the future avoid that substance that had made them sick? So he had these rats that consumed, water that was tainted with a chemical that would make them feel nauseated. And as long as 48 hours later, he would reintroduce that liquid again, and the rats would display taste aversion. They wanted nothing to do with that substance. So the delay between feeling nauseated and that taste could be really a long delay. He could, up to 48 hours could separate being exposed to the nausea-inducing substance and then actually getting nauseated. So he said maybe it doesn't have to be immediately paired. Now, just to underscore how stressful it is to be a person who's questioning part of the theory. Jung questioned part of Freud's theory, and it caused him to be excommunicated, basically, from the psychoanalytic community. Freud wouldn't speak to him for the rest of his life because he tried to introduce something different from Freud's model. And Jung never had the kind of profile that he had when he was in lockstep with Freud. So introducing something different caused Jung a lot of sort of personal and professional difficulty. Garcia attempted to publish his findings when he discovered that you could present the nausea-inducing liquid, and then even if the rat doesn't get sick for up to 48 hours, the rat will still make the association between the liquid and the nausea. When he tried to publish that, he got rejected by several journals, and they were saying things like, you must have falsified your data. Learning doesn't work like this. And really questioned like his ethics and his personal, behavior and things. I know these things because he gave a firsthand talk to a bunch of us grad students at the University of New Mexico. And he said it took him 7 years to finally publish that data. And he ended up replicating the study a bunch of times to show that it wasn't a fluke. It wasn't falsified data. Now it's become something called the Garcia effect. So it has had an impact on learning theory, but I'm going to guess that a lot of you have never heard of it. You've heard of Pavlov, but you probably haven't heard about Garcia. You might have heard about taste aversions, but you probably didn't hear about Garcia. The idea that, questioning part of a theory or altering part of a theory can be quite stressful. That's the issue I wanted to raise. And then I wanted to really underscore that when there are lots of areas in a theory that are not holding up to the predictions, right? Like as we're testing the hypotheses that are generated from the theory, if the theory is not holding up to these tests, it does weaken the theory. And it may not overturn the theory, but it might make people go, yeah, I've heard that that's actually got some flaws in it, right? And they might not even know what the flaws are, but they might start looking elsewhere for an explanation. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that a lot of times the person or the researchers who have offered something that is different from the original paradigm, it's not necessarily the case that they're now going to become the dominant theory. They might just be a little footnote in the, pathway towards weakening that original theory. All right. I'm going to transition and then I'm going to have you watch a video after this. So first I want to introduce this concept of how pseudoscience relates to converging evidence. So one of the ways that you can tell that people are thinking pseudoscientifically instead of scientifically is that they will assert that science is conducted through insight, that science is really, an aha moment where a person just sort of gets a flash of insight and suddenly they see the pattern. And, it kind of implies that anyone could do it and that there aren't any really scientific methods involved in it. It's just, it also fits in with the great man theory, right? The idea that, Einstein was special and only Einstein could have come up with the theories that he came up with, those kinds of things. So I want you to watch this little piece that explains how Kekula envisioned the format of benzene, and then we'll come back and talk about that in the next lecture.